You should know what happened this 1415 and why it is the most important event in history. The Voynich Manuscript, an illustrated codex written in an entirely unknown script and language, filled with bizarre plants, mysterious astronomy, and unexplained nude figures, was created somewhere in Central Europe and remains completely undeciphered despite centuries of the most brilliant minds on Earth attempting to crack its code. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now imagine this. You walk into a quiet, temperature-controlled vault in one of the most prestigious libraries on the planet. The air is cool. The lights are dim on purpose. There are manuscripts everywhere, some of them older than entire nations. Scrolls that kings once held. Letters that changed the course of wars. Maps that guided explorers across oceans no one had ever crossed. But none of them, not a single one, gets more visitors, more researchers, more phone calls, more emails, and more obsessive attention than one single book sitting quietly behind glass. It does not look like much at first glance. It is small. It is old. Its pages are made of vellum, which is calfskin that has been stretched and dried and treated so that someone could write on it. The cover is plain. There is no gold leaf, no jeweled binding, no royal seal pressed into leather. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might walk right past it. You might think it was just another old book from medieval Europe, interesting perhaps, but not earth-shattering. But then someone tells you to open it, and the moment you see the first page, everything changes, because the writing inside this book is not in Latin, it is not in Greek. It is not in Arabic or Hebrew or any form of Old German or Old French or Old English or any language that any human being has ever been able to identify. The script flows beautifully across the page. The letters, if you can even call them letters, are elegant and consistent. Whoever wrote them clearly had a system, clearly had a structure, clearly was communicating something. But what they were communicating, no one alive today can tell you. No one who has ever lived since this book was rediscovered has been able to tell you. The words do not match any known language. The alphabet does not correspond to any known writing system. And the illustrations, the drawings that fill nearly every page of this manuscript are just as bewildering as the text. There are plants in this book, dozens and dozens of them, but they are not real plants. Or at least they do not look like any real plants that any botanist has ever been able to identify with certainty. Some of them have roots that look like human bodies. Some have leaves that spiral in ways no actual leaf has ever spiraled. Some have flowers that exist in no garden, no forest, no greenhouse, no swamp, and no desert anywhere on this planet. They look like plants from a dream, or plants from another world. Or plants that someone invented entirely inside their own mind for reasons that remain completely unknown. There are astronomical diagrams, circles within circles, stars arranged in patterns. Suns and moons drawn with faces on them, staring out from pages that are over 600 years old. Some of these diagrams seem to reference zodiac signs. Others seem to map the heavens in ways that do not align with any known astronomical tradition from any culture. There are charts that might be calendars or might be something else entirely. And then there are the women. Dozens of women drawn naked, bathing in pools of green and blue liquid that flow through strange tubes and channels. They stand in what appear to be elaborate plumbing systems. They hold objects that cannot be identified. Their bodies are drawn simply, almost childishly, yet they are clearly important to whatever the manuscript is trying to communicate. Who are these women? Why are they bathing? What are the tubes and the pools and the flowing liquids? No one knows. Absolutely no one knows. This is the Voynich Manuscript. Named after Wilfrid Voynich, the man who brought it to public attention in the early 20th century, it has been called the most mysterious manuscript in the world, and that is not an exaggeration. It is not a marketing slogan. It is simply the truth. Because for over 100 years, since Voynich purchased it from a Jesuit college in Italy in 1912, the greatest codebreakers, linguists, historians, mathematicians, computer scientists, and cryptographers on Earth have tried to read this book. Many of them were people who cracked codes that changed the outcome of wars, people who deciphered ancient languages that had been dead for thousands of years, people who built the very foundations of modern computer science. And every single one of them failed. The Voynich manuscript remains undeciphered. It remains unread. It remains, to this day, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of human history. And tonight we are going to try to understand why. Let us start at the beginning, or at least let us start at what we think is the beginning, because with this manuscript nothing is ever certain. The vellum, the calfskin pages of the manuscript, has been carbon dated by researchers at the University of Arizona. Carbon dating, for those who may not be familiar, is a scientific method of determining how old an organic material is by measuring the decay of a radioactive isotope called carbon-14. Every living thing absorbs carbon-14 from the atmosphere while it is alive. When it dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14, and the isotope begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 is left in a piece of vellum, scientists can determine approximately when the animal whose skin became that vellum was alive. The results of the carbon dating were announced in 2009, and they were remarkable. The vellum of the Voynich manuscript dates to between 1404 and 1438. That places its creation squarely in the early 15th century, during a period of European history that was absolutely pivotal. This was the late Middle Ages. The Renaissance was just beginning to stir in the Italian city-states. The great cathedrals of Europe were nearing completion. The printing press had not yet been invented by Johannes Gutenberg, which means this book was written entirely by hand. Every word, every illustration, every diagram painstakingly created by someone using ink and quill on prepared calfskin. Now here is something important to understand. Carbon dating tells us when the vellum was made. It does not necessarily tell us when the writing was put onto the vellum. It is theoretically possible, though most scholars consider it unlikely, that someone could have obtained old blank vellum and written on it later. But the ink analysis, which has also been performed on the manuscript, is consistent with inks used in the early 15th century. The style of the illustrations, the types of pigments used, the binding techniques, all of these are consistent with the carbon-dated range. So the scientific consensus is clear. This manuscript was created somewhere in Central Europe around the year 1415, give or take a couple of decades, but who created it and why? These are the questions that burn at the heart of the mystery. Let us talk about the physical object itself because the details matter. The Voynich manuscript currently resides in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where it is catalogued as MS-408. It consists of approximately 240 pages, though some pages are missing and others are fold-out pages that expand to several times the size of a normal page when unfolded. The entire manuscript measures roughly 23.5 centimeters by 16.2 centimeters, which is about 9 inches by 6 inches. It would fit comfortably in your hands. You could hold the entire mystery of the Voynich manuscript between your palms. The text is written from left to right, which is the standard direction for most European languages. The writing appears to flow naturally, without excessive corrections or hesitations. There are very few places in the manuscript where the writer seems to have made a mistake and corrected it. This suggests that whoever wrote it was fluent in whatever system they were using. They were not struggling. They were not translating laboriously from another source. They were writing with the confidence and speed of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The manuscript appears to be divided into several sections based on the types of illustrations that accompany the text. Scholars have identified at least 5 or 6 distinct sections, though the exact divisions are debated. The first section is often called the herbal section or the botanical section. It takes up roughly the first half of the manuscript and features page after page of plant illustrations, each accompanied by blocks of the mysterious text. In a normal herbal manuscript from this period, you would expect to see illustrations of real plants, plants that a physician or apothecary would use for medicinal purposes. Medieval herbals were practical reference books. They showed you what a plant looked like so you could identify it in the wild, and the accompanying text would describe the plant's properties, its uses, and how to prepare it. The Voynich herbal section looks, at first glance, like it might be serving the same purpose. But the plants are wrong. They are simply wrong. Some of the plants in the Voynich manuscript have features from multiple real plants combined into a single illustration. A root from one species, leaves from another, flowers from a third. Some have features that no real plant possesses at all. Over the years, botanists have tried to match the Voynich plants to real species. Some have claimed partial matches. A few illustrations might, if you squint and use your imagination, resemble sunflowers or water lilies or certain species of fern. But these identifications are always tentative, always contested, and never convincing enough to gain universal acceptance. The overwhelming consensus is that most of the plants in the Voynich manuscript cannot be identified as any known species. This is deeply strange, because if the manuscript is a genuine herbal, why would the plants be unrecognizable? If it is meant to be a practical medical or pharmaceutical reference, how could anyone use it if the plants depicted do not actually exist? This is one of the many puzzles within the larger puzzle, a mystery nested inside a mystery, which is what the Voynich manuscript does to you. Every question leads to another question. Every answer opens 10 more doors. The second major section is the astronomical section. Here you find circular diagrams that appear to depict celestial objects and phenomena. There are drawings that look like zodiac signs. Researchers have identified what appear to be depictions of Aries, Taurus, and other zodiac symbols, though these identifications are not without controversy. There are concentric circles with stars and text arranged around them. Some pages feature large, elaborate diagrams that seem to map the positions of celestial bodies. One famous fold-out page contains a large circular design that some researchers believe is a map of the sky, while others think it might be a cosmological diagram showing the structure of the universe as the author understood it. What makes the astronomical section so frustrating is that it almost makes sense. You can see the zodiac symbols and think, yes, I understand what this is trying to do, but then the details do not add up. The number of stars in certain groupings does not match known constellations. The arrangement of the zodiac signs does not follow the standard order. Labels and text surround every element, but since the text is unreadable, you cannot use it to confirm or deny any interpretation. You are left with diagrams that look like they should be telling you something profound about the medieval understanding of the heavens, but refuse to give up their meaning. The third section is perhaps the most bizarre and the most discussed. It is sometimes called the biological section, sometimes the balneological section, the word balneological referring to the study of bathing and its therapeutic effects. This section contains page after page of small female figures drawn naked. They are depicted standing or wading in pools of liquid. The liquid is usually colored green or blue. The pools are connected by an elaborate network of tubes, pipes, and channels that looks for all the world like some kind of plumbing system, or perhaps some kind of biological diagram showing the flow of fluids through a system. The women are drawn with exaggerated abdomens in some cases, which has led some researchers to speculate that the section deals with pregnancy or gynecology. Others think the bathing scenes are related to some kind of ritual purification or therapeutic bathing practice that was common in parts of medieval Europe. Still others think the tubes and pools represent the human circulatory system or some other internal biological process, with the women serving as symbolic representations rather than literal depictions of actual bathing scenes. No one knows for certain what this section means. The women are drawn simply, almost like stick figures in some cases, with round bodies and minimal detail. Yet they are clearly important to the manuscript's purpose. There are dozens of them, and they appear consistently throughout this section. If you removed all the text and just looked at the pictures, you would think you were looking at the schematic for some kind of elaborate water park designed by a medieval engineer with an unusual imagination. But of course the text is there, flowing around and between the figures, presumably explaining everything if only someone could read it. The fourth section is sometimes called the pharmaceutical section. It features drawings of what appear to be jars, containers, and vessels of various shapes and sizes. These are accompanied by drawings of plant parts, roots, leaves, and stems, arranged in ways that suggest recipes or formulations. If the herbal section shows you the raw plants, this section seems to show you what to do with them, how to prepare them, what to combine them with, what containers to store them in. At least that is the most common interpretation. It looks like a medieval pharmacopoeia, a reference guide for preparing medicines. But once again, the plants are unidentifiable, the text is unreadable, and the entire thing could mean something completely different from what we think it means. The fifth section, sometimes called the recipe section or the stars section, is the most text-heavy part of the manuscript. It contains page after page of text with very few illustrations. The illustrations that do appear are mostly small stars or flower-like shapes in the margins. This section seems like it might be the most important part of the book, the part where the author gets down to the real substance of whatever they are trying to communicate. But without the ability to read the text, this section is also the most opaque. It is pure mystery, pages and pages of mysterious words that flow in neat lines across aged vellum, saying something that no living person can understand. Now let us talk about the script itself, because the writing system of the Voynich Manuscript is one of its most fascinating and most studied features. The script used in the manuscript is sometimes called Voynichese by researchers. It consists of approximately 20 to 30 distinct characters, depending on how you count them, which is roughly the size of a typical alphabet. The characters are written in a flowing, cursive style that suggests the writer was well practiced. Some characters resemble letters from the Latin alphabet, others look somewhat like Arabic or Greek characters, but the overall system does not match any known writing system. The text exhibits statistical properties that are deeply puzzling. On one hand, it shows many of the features you would expect in a genuine natural language. The frequency distribution of characters follows patterns similar to those found in real languages. Certain characters appear more often than others, just as the letter E appears more often than the letter Z in English. There are patterns in how characters combine. Certain characters tend to appear at the beginnings of words, others tend to appear at the ends. Some combinations of characters are common, while others never occur. These are exactly the kinds of patterns you would expect to find in a real language, and they have led many researchers to conclude that the text is not random gibberish but represents a genuine linguistic system. On the other hand, the text has some very unusual statistical properties that do not match any known language. One of the most striking is the low entropy of the text. Entropy in information theory is a measure of the unpredictability or randomness of information. Natural languages have a certain level of entropy. The Voynich text has unusually low entropy, meaning it is more repetitive and predictable than most natural languages. Words repeat frequently. Certain phrases appear over and over. Some researchers have compared the repetitiveness of the Voynich text to the kind of output you might get from a mechanical encoding device or a structured method of generating text. Another unusual feature is the way words are distributed in the text. In most natural languages, when you chart the frequency of words, the very common words like the and is appear overwhelmingly often, while rare words appear very seldom, and there is a smooth distribution in between. This is known as Zipf's law, named after the linguist George Kingsley Zipf. The Voynich text follows Zipf's law, which is a point in favor of it being a real language, but it follows it in a slightly unusual way. The distribution is too smooth, too perfect in some analyses. This has led some researchers to argue that the text was generated by some kind of algorithmic process rather than being the natural output of human thought. The words in the Voynich manuscript also tend to cluster by section. In the herbal section, certain words appear frequently that are rare in the astronomical section, and vice versa. This is exactly what you would expect if the sections discuss different topics, just as a chapter about cooking in a normal book would use different vocabulary than a chapter about astronomy. This sectional variation is another point in favor of the text being meaningful rather than random. But here is where it gets really strange. Despite all these language-like properties, no one has been able to crack the code, not even close, and it is not for lack of trying. let us talk about some of the people who have tried, because the list of minds that have grappled with the Voynich manuscript reads like a hall of fame of intellectual achievement. We need to go back to the early 20th century, to the man whose name is forever attached to the manuscript. Wilfrid Michael Voynich was born in 1865 in what was then the Russian Empire, in the territory that is now Lithuania. He was a revolutionary in his youth, involved in anti-Russian political activities that got him arrested and sent to Siberia. He escaped from Siberia, made his way across Europe, and eventually settled in London, where he became an antiquarian book dealer. He was brilliant, charismatic, and endlessly driven. He had an eye for rare books and manuscripts, and he made it his life's work to find lost treasures of the written word. In 1912, Voynich traveled to Italy to examine a collection of manuscripts held by the Jesuits at the Villa Mondragon, a grand Renaissance estate near the town of Frascati, not far from Rome. The Jesuits were selling off parts of their collection to raise funds, and Voynich was there to see what treasures might be available. Among the manuscripts he examined, one stood out immediately. It was the strange, illustrated codex with the unreadable text. Voynich knew at once that he had found something extraordinary. He purchased the manuscript along with several others and brought it back with him. But Voynich did more than just buy the manuscript. He began to research its history, and what he found added layers of intrigue to an already mysterious object. Tucked inside the manuscript was a letter. A letter dated 1666, written by Johannes Marcus Marci, a physician and scientist who was the rector of Charles University in Prague, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe. The letter was addressed to Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar who was one of the most famous intellectuals of the 17th century. Kircher was a polymath who published books on everything from Egyptian hieroglyphics to music theory to volcanology. He was also known for his attempts to decipher mysterious texts and codes. In his letter, Marci told Kircher that he was sending him a mysterious book that had been bequeathed to him by a friend, Georg Bersch, an alchemist who lived in Prague. Marci wrote that Bersch had spent years trying to decipher the manuscript and had failed. Bersch believed the manuscript contained secrets of great importance, possibly related to medicine or natural philosophy. He had written to Kircher at least once before, sending him samples of the text and asking for help in decoding it. Kircher apparently never responded, or at least no response has survived, but the letter contained an even more tantalizing detail. Marci wrote that he had been told by an unspecified source that the manuscript had once belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf II ruled from 1576 to 1612, and his court in Prague was legendary. Rudolf was obsessed with art, science, astrology, alchemy, and the occult. He surrounded himself with painters, sculptors, astronomers, alchemists, and magicians. His court was a magnet for anyone who claimed to possess secret knowledge or mysterious powers. And according to Marci's letter, Rudolf had purchased the manuscript for the extraordinary sum of 600 ducats. 600 ducats was an enormous amount of money in the late 16th century. To put it in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn about 50 ducats in an entire year. 600 ducats was enough to buy a large house. It was the kind of money you would only spend on something you believed to be genuinely extraordinary, and the implication was clear. Rudolf believed the manuscript was the real thing. He believed it contained genuine hidden knowledge. He paid a fortune for it. But who sold it to him? According to one tradition, the manuscript was brought to Rudolf's court by an Englishman named John Dee. And this is where the story takes a turn into territory that is almost too extraordinary to believe. John Dee was one of the most remarkable figures of the Elizabethan age. Born in 1527, he was a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England. He was also deeply involved in the occult, spending years trying to communicate with angels through a practice called scrying, which involved gazing into crystal balls or polished mirrors and recording the messages he believed the angels were sending him. His partner in these sessions was Edward Kelley, a man of considerably more questionable character, who served as the medium through whom the angelic communications were received. Dee and Kelley traveled together to Central Europe in the 1580s, visiting the courts of various rulers, including the court of Rudolf II in Prague. They claimed to possess the ability to transmute base metals into gold and to communicate with supernatural beings. They had access to Rudolf's court and were active in Prague for several years. The connection between Dee and the Voynich Manuscript is based on several pieces of circumstantial evidence. The manuscript was clearly in Prague by the early 17th century, and Dee was in Prague in the late 16th century. The price of 600 ducats that Rudolf allegedly paid for the manuscript is consistent with the kind of transaction that might have involved a figure like Dee, who was always in need of money and always willing to offer mysterious objects and knowledge to wealthy patrons. Some researchers have speculated that Dee might have brought the manuscript from England, where he had access to a vast library of medieval manuscripts that was eventually destroyed or scattered. But here is where skepticism is warranted. There is no direct documentary evidence that Dee ever possessed the Voynich manuscript. The connection is based on the letter from Marci, which mentions Rudolf as a former owner but does not specifically name Dee as the seller. The idea that Dee sold the manuscript to Rudolf comes from later speculation, not from any primary source. Some researchers have suggested that it was not Dee but Kelley who brought the manuscript to Rudolf, or that it was someone else entirely. Others have argued that the tradition linking the manuscript to Rudolf's court is unreliable, and that the manuscript's provenance before the 17th century is essentially unknown. But what about the possibility that the manuscript was not just sold to Rudolf by Dee or Kelley, but was actually created by one of them? This is one of the theories that has circulated for over a century, and it deserves serious examination. The theory goes like this. Edward Kelley was a known forger. Before his association with Dee, Kelley had been convicted of forgery in England and had his ears cropped as punishment, a common penalty for forgery at the time. He spent his entire career making claims that could not be verified, performing alchemical demonstrations that were likely fraudulent, and generally operating on the boundary between genuine scholarship and outright deception. If anyone in the 16th century had the motive and the temperament to create a fake manuscript full of meaningless text and sell it to a gullible emperor for 600 ducats, it was Edward Kelley. But there are serious problems with this theory. The carbon dating of the vellum places the manuscript's creation between 1404 and 1438, well over a century before Kelley was born. For Kelley to have created the manuscript, he would have had to obtain a large supply of genuinely old blank vellum, which was possible but not easy. He would also have had to create the ink, the illustrations, and the text in a way that was perfectly consistent with early 15th century materials and techniques. While this is not impossible, it adds layers of complexity and improbability to the forgery theory. Furthermore, the statistical properties of the Voynich text, the patterns and structures that we discussed earlier, are far more sophisticated than anything a 16th century forger would likely have been able to produce. Creating 240 pages of text that mimics the statistical properties of a natural language without actually being a natural language is extraordinarily difficult. It would require a level of mathematical and linguistic sophistication that simply did not exist in the 16th century. Even modern computers and modern artificial intelligence systems struggle to produce text that perfectly mimics all the statistical properties of natural language. The idea that Kelley, working by hand with a quill pen, could have done this is extremely implausible. This does not mean that the manuscript is not a hoax. It might be. But if it is a hoax of almost supernatural sophistication, created by someone who understood principles of language and information theory that would not be formally described for another 5 centuries. Let us move forward in time and talk about the modern attempts to decipher the manuscript, because the story of who has tried and how they have failed is almost as fascinating as the manuscript itself. After Voynich acquired the manuscript in 1912, he began showing it to scholars and experts, hoping that someone would be able to read it. He sent photographs of pages to various universities and research institutions. He gave lectures about the manuscript. He generated enormous excitement and interest, and for a while, it seemed like a solution might be just around the corner. One of the first serious attempts to decipher the manuscript was made by William Romaine Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Newbold was a highly respected scholar, an expert in medieval philosophy and the history of science. He began studying the manuscript in the early 1920s and in 1921 announced that he had cracked the code. His announcement was sensational. He claimed that the manuscript was the work of the 13th century English friar Roger Bacon, one of the most important scientific minds of the medieval period. Bacon was a Franciscan friar who studied mathematics, optics, alchemy, and astronomy. He was centuries ahead of his time in many ways, advocating for experimental science long before the scientific method was formally developed. Newbold claimed that the text of the Voynich Manuscript was written in a complex cipher that involved multiple layers of encoding. He said that the individual characters were made up of tiny shorthand marks that could only be seen under magnification. By analyzing these microscopic marks and applying a series of anagramming and rearrangement steps, Newbold claimed to have extracted meaningful Latin text, and the content of this text, according to Newbold, was staggering. He said that Roger Bacon had used the manuscript to record observations made through a microscope and a telescope, centuries before those instruments were supposedly invented. Bacon had observed the spiral structure of galaxies. He had seen biological cells. He had made discoveries that would not be redone until the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. If Newbold was right, the Voynich Manuscript was not just a curiosity. It was one of the most important documents in the history of science, proof that the medieval world was far more scientifically advanced than anyone had ever imagined. But Newbold was not right. His decipherment was torn apart by other scholars, most devastatingly by John Matthews Manley, a professor at the University of Chicago who was also an expert cryptanalyst. Manley published a detailed critique of Newbold's method in 1931 and demonstrated conclusively that the microscopic marks Newbold had identified were not intentional shorthand, but simply the natural cracking and degradation of old ink on vellum. Manley further showed that Newbold's anagramming method was so flexible that it could be used to extract virtually any message from any text. The method did not decode the manuscript. It allowed the decoder to project whatever they wanted to find onto random patterns. Newbold's decipherment collapsed completely, and it served as a cautionary tale that would echo through the decades of Voynich research to come. The manuscript is a mirror. It reflects back whatever the researcher brings to it. If you are looking for Roger Bacon, you will find Roger Bacon. If you are looking for alchemy, you will find alchemy. If you are looking for an alien language, you will find an alien language. The Voynich manuscript is so resistant to interpretation that it becomes whatever you want it to be, which means it becomes nothing at all. After Newbold's failure, the manuscript attracted the attention of an entirely different kind of expert. During and after the Second World War, some of the most brilliant codebreakers in the world turned their attention to the Voynich manuscript. These were people who had broken real military codes that had been designed by the best minds of hostile nations to be unbreakable. If anyone could crack the Voynich code, it was these people. One of the most notable was William Friedman, who is widely considered one of the greatest cryptanalysts in history. Friedman was instrumental in breaking the Japanese purple cipher during the Second World War, a feat that had enormous consequences for the conduct of the war in the Pacific. After the war, Friedman assembled a study group to tackle the Voynich manuscript. This group included other experienced cryptanalysts, and they worked on the manuscript intermittently for years. Friedman's approach was methodical and rigorous. He applied the techniques of modern cryptanalysis, the same techniques that had broken supposedly unbreakable military codes, to the Voynich text. He analyzed letter frequencies, digraph frequencies, word patterns, and every other statistical feature he could measure, and after years of work he came to a conclusion that was both fascinating and deeply frustrating. Friedman believed that the Voynich Manuscript was not a simple substitution cipher, where each character stands for a letter in a known language, nor was it a more complex polyalphabetic cipher, where the encoding changes according to a key. Instead, Friedman suspected that the manuscript might be written in an artificial language, a constructed language created specifically for the purpose of recording information in a way that could not be read by outsiders. If this was the case, then traditional code-breaking methods would not work because there was no underlying plaintext in a known language to be recovered. The Voynich text was not a code hiding a message. The Voynich text was the message, written in a language that existed only in the mind of its creator. This was a revolutionary idea, and it remains one of the most influential theories about the manuscript to this day. But it was also deeply discouraging because if Friedman was right, then the manuscript could only be deciphered if you could somehow learn the artificial language from scratch, using only the text itself as your guide, with no bilingual key, no Rosetta Stone, no point of reference. This is essentially the same challenge that would face someone trying to learn an entirely unknown alien language from a single document, with no native speakers to consult and no parallel texts to compare. Friedman never cracked the Voynich manuscript. He died in 1969, and his personal papers on the manuscript, including extensive notes and analyses, were eventually donated to a library where they can be studied by future researchers. The greatest codebreaker in history had met his match, but Friedman was not the only world-class cryptanalyst to try. Another was Brigadier John Tiltman, a British codebreaker who is considered one of the finest cryptanalysts in the history of British intelligence. Tiltman worked on the Voynich manuscript intermittently from the 1950s through the 1970s. Like Friedman, Tiltman was unable to crack the code, but his work produced important insights. Tiltman made detailed studies of the Voynich script and identified several structural features that would inform later research. He noted that the script had a strong positional structure. Certain characters tended to appear only at the beginning of words, others appeared only in the middle, others appeared only at the end. This is a feature of many natural languages. In English, for example, the letter combination th often appears at the beginning of words like the and this, but rarely at the end. The fact that the Voynich script showed similar positional patterns was evidence. Tiltman believed that the text was not random but followed genuine linguistic rules. Tiltman also noted that the text had an unusual lack of apparent corrections. In most handwritten manuscripts from this period, you can find places where the scribe made a mistake and crossed out a word or inserted a correction above the line. The Voynich manuscript has very few such corrections. This could mean that the writer was copying from another source very carefully, or it could mean that the writer was generating the text through some kind of mechanical or algorithmic process that did not produce errors, or it could simply mean that the writer was very skilled and very confident in what they were writing. After the codebreakers came the linguists, and after the linguists came the computer scientists, and the manuscript defeated all of them. We will talk about those later attempts in detail, but first, let us step back and consider some of the broader theories about what the manuscript might actually be. There are several major theories, and each has its supporters and its critics. The first theory is that the manuscript is a genuine work of scholarship written in an encoded form to protect its contents from unauthorized readers. Under this theory, the author was a physician, alchemist, or natural philosopher who possessed knowledge they considered dangerous or valuable. They chose to record this knowledge using either a cipher or a private script that only they, and perhaps a small circle of trusted associates, could read. The illustrations of plants, stars, and bathing women would represent genuine medical, astronomical, and therapeutic knowledge, encrypted to prevent persecution by religious or political authorities. This theory is attractive because it fits the historical context. The early 15th century was a time when unorthodox ideas could get you killed. The Catholic Church controlled intellectual life across Europe, and ideas that deviated from accepted doctrine could be branded as heresy. Alchemists and natural philosophers often faced suspicion and sometimes outright persecution. It would make sense for someone with heterodox ideas to want to protect their work by writing it in a code that outsiders could not read. But this theory has weaknesses. If the manuscript is a cipher, why has no one been able to break it? Ciphers from the 15th century, even sophisticated ones, should be breakable by modern techniques. The ciphers of that era were relatively simple by today's standards, typically involving substitution of letters or transposition of elements. Modern cryptanalysis has tools and computing power that would have been unimaginable to a 15th century code maker. The fact that the Voynich code has resisted all attempts at breaking suggests either that it is an extraordinarily sophisticated cipher, far beyond anything else known from the period, or that it is not a cipher at all. The second theory is the one proposed by Friedman, that the manuscript is written in an artificial language. Under this theory, the author invented not just a new script, but an entirely new language, complete with its own grammar, vocabulary, and structure. This would explain why the text has language-like statistical properties, but does not match any known language. It would also explain why traditional code-breaking methods have failed, because there is no hidden plaintext to recover. The idea of constructed languages was not unknown in the 15th century, though it was rare. The most famous early attempt at constructing a universal language was made by the mystic and philosopher Ramon Llull in the 13th century. Llull created a system of symbols and combinatorial wheels that he believed could generate all possible truths through systematic combination. It is possible, some researchers have argued, that the Voynich author was influenced by Llull's ideas or by similar attempts at creating new linguistic systems. But the artificial language theory also has problems. Creating a fully functional artificial language with consistent grammar and vocabulary, and then writing 240 pages in it, complete with complex illustrations, is an enormous undertaking. It would require not just linguistic creativity, but also the patience and discipline to use the invented language consistently across a massive document without making errors or introducing inconsistencies. And the question remains, why? Why would someone go to such extraordinary effort? What was the purpose? The third theory is that the manuscript is a hoax. Under this theory, the text is meaningless gibberish, carefully constructed to look like a genuine coded document, but actually containing no information at all. The manuscript would have been created to deceive a wealthy buyer, possibly Emperor Rudolf II, into paying a large sum of money for what they believed was a repository of secret knowledge. The hoax theory has a certain elegant simplicity. It explains why no one has been able to decode the text. You cannot decode something that has no meaning. It also fits the historical context. The late medieval and early modern periods were rife with fraud and deception, particularly in the fields of alchemy and the occult. Fake texts, fake relics, and fake claims of supernatural knowledge were common. Selling a bogus manuscript to a gullible emperor would have been entirely in character for the kind of people who operated in these circles. But the hoax theory faces its own serious challenges. As we discussed earlier, the statistical properties of the Voynich text are remarkably language-like. Creating text that mimics the statistical properties of natural language without actually being natural language is extremely difficult. Several researchers have tried to construct methods by which a hoax could have been produced, the most famous being the rug method proposed by computer scientist Gordon Rugg in 2004. Rugg demonstrated that a device called a cardon grill, a card with holes cut in it that is placed over a table of text to select certain elements, could potentially be used to generate text with some of the statistical properties found in the Voynich manuscript. Rugg showed that by sliding a cardon grill over a table of Voynich-like characters, a hoaxer could produce text that appeared structured and language-like without containing any actual meaning. This was a significant finding because it showed that it was at least theoretically possible for someone in the 15th or 16th century to have produced the Voynich text as a hoax using available technology. However, critics of Rugg's work have pointed out that his method does not reproduce all of the statistical properties of the Voynich text. The real manuscript has features of complexity and structure that a simple cardon grill method cannot easily replicate. Furthermore, producing 240 pages of text using such a method would still be an enormous and tedious undertaking. The hoaxer would have needed a very strong motive, a lot of patience, and considerable ingenuity to carry it off. The fourth theory is perhaps the most provocative. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript is a work of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, transcribed into written form. Under this theory, the author may have been in an altered state of consciousness, perhaps induced by meditation, fasting, drug use, or mental illness, and believed that they were receiving divine or supernatural communications. They transcribed what they heard or experienced using a script of their own invention, and the resulting text reflects the semi-random but patterned output of a mind in an altered state. This theory is interesting because it could explain some of the text's unusual properties. Glossolalia, when it has been studied scientifically, tends to produce utterances that have some language-like features, such as a relatively small inventory of sounds and some recurring patterns, but lack the full complexity and structure of natural language. If the Voynich text is written glossolalia, it might naturally have the kind of intermediate statistical properties that have been observed, more structured than random text but less complex than genuine language. However, this theory is highly speculative and difficult to test. We have no way of knowing the mental state of the author, and the manuscript shows none of the obvious signs of disordered thought or chaotic writing that you might expect from someone experiencing mental illness or an altered state of consciousness. The text is neat, consistent, and carefully organized. The illustrations, while strange, are skillfully executed. This does not look like the work of someone in the grip of madness or ecstasy. It looks like the work of someone who was calm, deliberate, and fully in control of what they were doing. There is a fifth theory that deserves mention, and it is one that has gained traction in recent years. Some researchers have suggested that the Voynich manuscript may be written in a natural language, but one that uses an unusual or idiosyncratic script and has a structure that is different enough from better-known languages to resist identification. Under this theory, the language might be a minority language or dialect from Central Europe, the Middle East, or even East Asia, written in a script invented by the author or adapted from an existing but obscure writing tradition. Several attempts have been made to link the Voynich text to specific languages. Some researchers have proposed that the underlying language is a form of medieval Latin with heavy abbreviation. Others have suggested Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, a Romance language, or even an early form of a Central Asian language. Each of these proposals has generated excitement when first announced, but none has held up to rigorous scrutiny. The identifications are always partial, always contested, and always fail to produce a coherent, verified translation of any substantial portion of the text. One of the most recent and most publicized claims was made by Gerard Cheshire of the University of Bristol, who in 2019 published a paper claiming that the Voynich manuscript was written in Proto-Romance, an ancestral form of the Romance languages that predates the divergence of Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. Cheshire claimed to have translated portions of the text and said the manuscript was a reference work on herbal remedies and therapeutic bathing, compiled by Dominican nuns for the court of Maria of Castile, Queen of Aragon. Cheshire's claims received enormous media attention, but were swiftly and roundly criticized by experts in medieval languages, cryptography, and Voynich studies. Linguists pointed out that Cheshire's Proto-Romance was not a real language, but a hypothetical reconstruction based on cherry-picked similarities between the Voynich text and various Romance languages. His translations were inconsistent and did not hold up when applied to other portions of the manuscript. Within days of publication, the paper was widely dismissed by the scholarly community, and the University of Bristol distanced itself from the claims. This pattern, bold claim followed by excitement, followed by devastating critique, followed by disappointment, has repeated itself over and over in the history of Voynich research. It has happened so many times that experienced Voynich researchers have a term for it. They call it a Voynich theory, and they use the phrase with a weary sigh. Because everyone who studies the manuscript eventually becomes convinced they have found the answer, and everyone who becomes convinced they have found the answer eventually turns out to be wrong. Let us now turn our attention to the physical properties of the manuscript in more detail, because the material analysis of the object itself has yielded some of the most reliable information we have. The vellum, as we discussed, has been carbon dated to between 1404 and 1438. But the analysis did not stop there. Researchers have also examined the ink and the pigments used in the illustrations. The ink used for the text appears to be an iron gall ink, which was the most common type of ink used in medieval Europe. Iron gall ink is made by combining iron sulfate with tannic acids derived from oak galls, which are growths on oak trees caused by the larvae of certain wasps. The resulting ink is a deep brownish black that was prized for its permanence and its resistance to fading. The iron gall ink in the Voynich Manuscript is consistent with inks from the early 15th century. The pigments used in the illustrations include several colors. There are greens, blues, reds, yellows, and browns. Analysis has shown that the green pigment contains copper, which is consistent with the use of copper-based pigments like verdigris or malachite, both of which were commonly used in medieval manuscript illustration. The blue pigment may be azurite, another common medieval pigment derived from a copper mineral. The red pigment appears to be an iron-based compound, possibly red ochre. All of these pigments are consistent with the carbon-dated range and with the practices of 15th century Central European manuscript production. One interesting finding from the physical analysis is that the text and the illustrations appear to have been created in a specific order. The text was generally written first, with spaces left for the illustrations, which were added afterward. In some places, you can see where the text wraps around the space reserved for an illustration, indicating that the writer planned the layout of each page in advance. The paintings were then applied on top of the text in some cases, with paint partially obscuring some characters. This kind of planned layout is common in medieval manuscript production and suggests that the creation of the Voynich manuscript was a deliberate, organized project, not a spontaneous or haphazard creation. The binding of the manuscript has been replaced at least once and possibly more than once since its creation. The current binding is not original. This means that we cannot be entirely certain of the original order of the pages. Some researchers have suggested that certain pages may be out of order, which could affect attempts at decipherment. If the pages were rearranged at some point, the text might not flow in the sequence the original author intended. The manuscript also appears to be incomplete. There are gaps in the quire structure, which is the way the vellum sheets were folded and nested to form the book. A quire is a group of sheets folded together, and medieval books were assembled by stacking quires and sewing them together. Analysis of the Voynich manuscript's quire structure suggests that several quires are missing, which means that the original manuscript was longer than the version that survives today. How much longer, it is impossible to say. We might be missing a few pages or a few dozen pages. The missing pages might contain the key to the entire manuscript, a glossary, a table of contents, a dedication, or some other element that would unlock the mystery. Or they might contain more of the same, more unreadable text and more unidentifiable plants. We will never know unless the missing pages are someday found. Let us talk about the provenance of the manuscript in more detail, tracing its known history from the earliest records to the present day. The earliest definite reference to the manuscript comes from the letter by Johannes Marcus Marci that we discussed earlier, written in 1666. From Marci's letter, we learn that the manuscript was previously owned by Georg Bersch, an alchemist in Prague who had it for many years and tried unsuccessfully to decipher it. Bersch died in the 1662, and the manuscript passed to Marci, who sent it to Athanasius Kircher in Rome. What happened to the manuscript between Kircher's receipt of it in 1666 and Voynich's discovery of it in 1912? This is a gap of nearly 250 years, and the trail is not entirely clear. but the most likely path has been reconstructed by researchers. Kircher was a Jesuit, and when he died in 1680, his papers and collections were absorbed into the Jesuit archives. The Voynich Manuscript would have gone with them. Over the following 2 centuries, the manuscript sat in various Jesuit collections in Rome, largely forgotten. When the Jesuits were suppressed by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, their properties and collections were dispersed. Some eventually found their way to the Villa Mondragon near Frascati, which is where Voynich found the manuscript in 1912. Voynich kept the manuscript until his death in 1930. It then passed to his widow Ethel Lillian Voynich, who was herself a remarkable woman, a novelist and translator best known for her novel The Gadfly. After her death in 1960, the manuscript was inherited by her friend Anne Nill, who had been Wilfrid Voynich's secretary. Nill sold it in 1961 to another antiquarian book dealer, Hans Peter Kraus. Kraus tried to sell the manuscript but was unable to find a buyer willing to pay his asking price. In 1969, Kraus donated the manuscript to Yale University, where it has remained ever since, housed in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. But what about the period before Berche? This is where things get truly murky. According to Marci's letter, the manuscript was once owned by Emperor Rudolf II. If this is true, the manuscript would have been in the imperial collections in Prague sometime between 1576 and 1612. Some researchers have tried to trace the manuscript's path from its creation around 1415 to Rudolf's court in the late 16th century, but this gap of roughly 150 years is a blank. One tantalizing clue comes from the manuscript itself. On the first page, there is an erased signature that has been partially recovered through ultraviolet photography. The signature appears to read Jacobus de Tepanek, which has been identified as Jacob Horczycki of Tepanek, a Bohemian pharmacist and botanist who was a favorite of Rudolf II. Horczycki was ennobled by Rudolf and given the title de Tepanek. His signature on the manuscript suggests that he owned it at some point, possibly receiving it from Rudolf or from someone in Rudolf's circle. Horczycki was an expert on medicinal plants, which fits with the herbal content of the manuscript. But beyond this signature, we know nothing about how Horczycki obtained the manuscript or what happened to it between his possession and Berche's. Now let me take you deeper into the world of the illustrations, because the images in the Voynich manuscript are not merely decorative. They are in many ways the most accessible part of the manuscript, the part that any person, regardless of linguistic training, can look at and try to make sense of. And yet they are, in their own way, just as baffling as the text. Let us start with the botanical illustrations. There are over 100 of them, and they dominate the first half of the manuscript. Each one shows a single plant, typically depicted from root to flower, with the mysterious text flowing around it. The illustrations are painted in the earthy, slightly muted palette typical of medieval botanical art, with greens, browns, and occasional splashes of blue or red. Now, medieval herbals were common. They were among the most widely produced types of manuscript in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Monasteries kept herbals, physicians kept herbals, apothecaries kept herbals. And the plants in these herbals were drawn from life, or, more often, copied from earlier herbals in a long chain of copying that stretched back to classical antiquity. The ultimate source for many European herbals was the De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, a Greek physician who lived in the 1st century. His descriptions of about 600 plants and their medicinal properties were copied and recopied, translated and retranslated for over 1,000 years. In a typical medieval herbal, you can usually identify the plants even when the illustrations are crude or stylized, because the key identifying features of each plant, the shape of its leaves, the arrangement of its flowers, the form of its roots, are preserved with reasonable accuracy. A botanical historian can look at a plant illustration from a 12th century English herbal and say, with reasonable confidence, that is a depiction of yarrow or foxglove or comfrey. You cannot do this with the Voynich plants, you simply cannot. Some of the plants have roots that are depicted as bulbous, twisted, humanoid shapes, as if the roots are trying to crawl out of the ground. Some have leaves that are perfectly symmetrical in ways that no natural leaf is symmetrical. Some have flowers that look like they belong on another planet. The level of detail in the illustrations suggests that the artist was trying to depict something specific. These are not casual doodles. They are careful, considered drawings of something. But of what? One possibility is that the plants are composites, fictional plants created by combining features from multiple real plants. This was not unheard of in medieval art. Some herbals included illustrations of legendary plants like the barnacle tree, which was believed to produce geese from its fruit, or the mandrake, which was depicted with a screaming human-shaped root. But the Voynich plants do not look like legendary plants. They look like they are trying to be real. They have the structural logic of real plants, with stems and branches and roots and flowers all in the right places. They just do not correspond to any real species. Another possibility is that the plants are real species depicted from a region that European scholars were unfamiliar with. Some researchers have suggested that the plants might be from the New World, from Africa, or from Central Asia, regions that were poorly documented in European botanical literature of the 15th century. But this theory has not produced convincing identifications either. A third possibility, one that is both simpler and more disturbing, is that the plants are intentionally unidentifiable. That the artist deliberately drew plants that could not be matched to real species because the purpose of the illustrations was not to document real plants but to serve some other function entirely, perhaps as a key to the cipher, perhaps as a mnemonic device, perhaps as something we cannot even imagine. Let us move to the astronomical diagrams. The astronomical section of the manuscript contains some of its most visually striking pages, including several fold-out pages that expand to show large, detailed circular diagrams. These diagrams feature concentric rings of text and images, with stars, suns, moons, and figures arranged in complex patterns. Some of the diagrams appear to depict zodiac signs. Researchers have identified what they believe are representations of Pisces, shown as 2 fish, and Aries, shown as a ram, among others. If these identifications are correct, then the astronomical section may be some kind of astrological or calendrical document, perhaps showing the relationships between celestial events and other phenomena, such as the growth of plants or the treatment of diseases. But as with everything else in the Voynich manuscript, the details do not quite fit. The zodiac signs, if that is what they are not arranged in the standard order. The number of stars associated with each sign does not match any known astronomical or astrological tradition. Some diagrams show groups of women arranged around a central star or sun, which is not a feature of any known zodiac system. And of course, the text that surrounds every diagram, presumably labeling and explaining what is shown, is completely unreadable. One particularly famous page shows a large circular diagram divided into sections, with what appear to be place names or labels written in the Voynich script. Some researchers have suggested that this might be a map rather than an astronomical diagram, perhaps showing a region of Central Europe or the Mediterranean. Others think it might be a cosmological diagram, showing the structure of the universe. Still others think it might be something else entirely, perhaps a diagram of the human body or the spiritual world. Without being able to read the labels, any interpretation is pure speculation. And so we come back to the fundamental problem, the problem that has haunted everyone who has ever studied this manuscript. You can look at the pictures and form theories. You can analyze the text and discover patterns. You can date the vellum and analyze the ink and trace the provenance and study the binding. But at the end of the day, you cannot read the book. You cannot understand what it says. And until someone finds a way to read it, the Voynich manuscript will remain what it has been for over 600 years. The most mysterious book in the world, a silent witness to a knowledge that may be profound or may be meaningless, but is, either way, utterly and completely beyond our reach. But does that mean we should give up? Does that mean the manuscript is destined to remain forever unread, a permanent monument to the limits of human ingenuity? Many people think so. Many seasoned researchers have concluded that the manuscript may never be deciphered, that whatever key is needed to unlock its secrets has been lost to time, but others disagree. They point to other great decipherments in history, cases where texts that were considered permanently unreadable were eventually cracked through persistence, insight, or sheer luck. The Egyptian hieroglyphics were unreadable for centuries until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 provided the key. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean civilization of ancient Greece, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an architect with no formal training in linguistics, using a combination of brilliance and dogged persistence. If these scripts could be cracked, why not the Voynich? The answer is that those decipherments had advantages that the Voynich does not. The Rosetta Stone provided a bilingual text, the same passage written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. This gave scholars a way in, a bridge between the known and the unknown. Linear B was cracked in part because Ventris was able to identify the underlying language as an early form of Greek, which gave him a framework to test his hypotheses against. The Voynich Manuscript has no Rosetta Stone. There is no bilingual text, no parallel document, no key. And the underlying language, if there is one, has not been identified. Without these anchoring points, decipherment may be impossible. But maybe, just maybe, the key is out there somewhere. Perhaps it is sitting in an overlooked archive in Prague or Rome, a forgotten letter or notebook that explains everything. Perhaps it is encoded in the manuscript itself, waiting for someone to notice a pattern that everyone else has missed. Perhaps the advancing power of computers and artificial intelligence will eventually crack what human minds alone could not. Because here's the thing about the Voynich Manuscript. It does not just resist understanding. It invites it. It demands it. Every page of that strange little book is a challenge, a dare, a whisper from 600 years ago saying, "I know something you do not." And as long as that whisper echoes, as long as that challenge stands unanswered, people will keep trying. Scholars will keep studying, computers will keep processing. And someday, perhaps, someone will sit down with the manuscript, notice something no one has noticed before, and the 600-year silence will finally be broken. But today is not that day. Today, the Voynich Manuscript remains exactly what it has always been. An enigma wrapped in vellum, a riddle drawn in ink, the most stubborn mystery in the entire history of the written word. And we are just getting started. Because in the second part of this documentary, we are going to go deeper. We are going to examine the most recent scientific analyses, the computer algorithms that have been unleashed on the text, the artificial intelligence programs that have attempted to crack the code. We are going to explore the cultural impact of the manuscript, the way it has inspired novels, films, video games, and conspiracy theories. We are going to meet the modern community of Voynich researchers, the passionate, obsessive, sometimes feuding band of scholars and amateurs who have devoted their lives to this mystery. And we are going to confront the hardest question of all. Does the Voynich Manuscript actually say anything? Or is it the greatest practical joke in history, a 600-year-old prank played by someone who is laughing at us from beyond the grave? The answer, whatever it turns out to be, will tell us something profound about the nature of knowledge, the limits of human understanding, and the enduring, irresistible power of a mystery that refuses to be solved. Stay with us. The history of the Voynich Manuscript is not merely a history of the manuscript itself. It is a history of obsession. It is a history of brilliant minds crashing against a wall they cannot see, cannot touch, and cannot climb. To understand why this book has consumed so many people, you have to understand something about the nature of puzzles and the human mind. We are, as a species, hardwired to seek patterns. We see faces in clouds. We hear words in static. We find meaning in randomness. This instinct served us well on the savannas where our ancestors evolved. The ability to spot a predator hiding in tall grass, to recognize the pattern of stripes on a tiger among the vertical lines of bamboo, was a matter of life and death. Those who saw patterns survived, those who did not were eaten. But this same instinct, this pattern-seeking drive, can also mislead us. It can make us see patterns that are not there. It can make us find meaning in meaninglessness. And nowhere is this danger more acute than in the study of the Voynich Manuscript. Because the manuscript is full of patterns, the text has structure, the illustrations have logic, every page seems to be on the verge of making sense. It is like a word that is right on the tip of your tongue, a memory that is almost but not quite within reach. And this almostness is what makes it so irresistible and so dangerous. Let us go back to the 17th century for a moment and consider the world in which the manuscript first entered the historical record. Prague of Rudolf II was one of the most extraordinary places in Europe. Rudolf had moved the imperial capital from Vienna to Prague in 1583, and he had transformed the city into a center of art, science, and the occult. His court attracted artists like Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who created fantastical portraits made of fruits and vegetables. It attracted astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, who were revolutionizing humanity's understanding of the cosmos. And it attracted alchemists, magicians, and seekers of hidden knowledge from all over Europe. Rudolf himself was a deeply troubled man. He suffered from what modern doctors would probably diagnose as severe depression. He became increasingly reclusive as his reign progressed, withdrawing from public life and spending more and more time in his private chambers, surrounded by his collections. He collected everything. Paintings, sculptures, clocks, scientific instruments, exotic animals, minerals, botanical specimens, and manuscripts. His Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, was one of the most famous collections in Europe. It was said to contain everything from a nail from Noah's Ark to a jar of dirt from the Holy Land to a horn that was supposedly from a unicorn. In this context, the purchase of a mysterious, unreadable manuscript for 600 ducats makes perfect sense. Rudolf was exactly the kind of person who would have been drawn to the Voynich Manuscript. It was mysterious, it was beautiful, it was unique, and it promised hidden knowledge. For Rudolf, collecting was not just a hobby. It was a way of trying to understand and control a world that increasingly bewildered and frightened him. Every object in his collection was a piece of the puzzle of existence, and the Voynich Manuscript, with its promise of unrevealable secrets, would have been the ultimate prize. But who brought it to him? We have discussed the theory involving John Dee and Edward Kelley, but there are other possibilities. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript might have come to Rudolf through his extensive network of agents and intermediaries, the men he sent across Europe to acquire objects for his collection. Others have suggested that it might have been a gift from a foreign dignitary or a visiting scholar. Without definitive documentary evidence, we cannot know for certain. What we can say is that the manuscript was in Prague by the early 17th century and that it remained in Prague until it was sent to Rome by Marci in 1666. During the decades between Rudolf's death in 1612 and Marci's letter in 1666, the manuscript appears to have passed through several hands in the scholarly and alchemical circles of Prague. Georg Bersch, the alchemist who Marci says spent years trying to decipher it, is a key figure in this chain, but we know very little about him beyond what Marci tells us. Bersch's frustration is palpable even through the second-hand account in Marci's letter. Here was a man who had a book he believed contained genuine, important knowledge about plants and medicines, and perhaps the secrets of the natural world, and he could not read it. He studied it for years, decades perhaps, turning the pages over and over, staring at the beautiful, maddening script, trying every approach he could think of. He wrote to Kircher, the most famous decoder of mysteries in Europe, begging for help, and he received nothing in return, no response, no solution, just silence. Bersch's experience foreshadows the experience of every Voynich researcher who would come after him. The manuscript offers the promise of understanding but delivers only frustration. It invites you in with its beautiful illustrations and its neatly written text, and then it slams the door in your face. It is the ultimate tease, the ultimate intellectual trap, and once you are caught in it, it is very hard to escape. Now let us consider something that is often overlooked in discussions of the Voynich manuscript, the skill of the person who created it. Whatever the text means and whether the illustrations represent real things or imaginary things, there is no denying that the manuscript was created by someone, or possibly a small team of people, with considerable artistic and organizational skill. The illustrations, while strange, are executed with care and precision. The botanical drawings show a consistent style, with similar techniques used for shading, coloring, and depicting structural details like leaf veins and root systems. The astronomical diagrams are geometrically sophisticated, with carefully drawn circles and evenly spaced elements. The biological or balneological section, with its dozens of female figures and elaborate plumbing networks, shows a lively and creative imagination combined with decent artistic ability. Some researchers have analyzed the handwriting in the manuscript and concluded that the text was written by at least 2 different scribes, possibly more. This is based on subtle differences in letter forms, writing speed, and the overall appearance of the text in different sections of the manuscript. If multiple scribes were involved, this suggests that the manuscript was a collaborative project, not the work of a single isolated individual. It suggests some kind of workshop or scriptorium, a place where people work together to produce manuscripts. This is significant because it affects our interpretation of the manuscript. If the manuscript was created by a single eccentric individual working alone, then theories involving personal codes, private languages, or individual madness are more plausible. But if it was a collaborative project involving multiple people, then whatever system was used to write the text must have been known and shared among the collaborators. This argues against the most extreme theories of personal idiosyncrasy and in favor of some kind of systematic, potentially teachable encoding method. The question of the author or authors brings us to another important issue, the geographical origin of the manuscript. The carbon dating tells us when it was made, but where was it made? The analysis of the vellum, ink, and pigments suggests Central Europe, but Central Europe is a big place. Several specific locations have been proposed. Some researchers have pointed to northern Italy as a possible origin. The illustration style has certain similarities with Italian botanical manuscripts of the period, and several of the zodiac figures are depicted with features that might suggest Italian artistic traditions. The connection to Rudolph's court in Prague and the later provenance through Jesuit collections in Rome could suggest an Italian origin. Others have suggested the area around modern-day Austria, Germany, or the Czech Republic. The calfskin vellum is consistent with production methods used throughout Central Europe, and the general style of the manuscript, with its combination of herbal, astronomical, and medical content, fits with the intellectual traditions of these regions. Still others have proposed more exotic origins. Some have suggested that the manuscript might have originated in the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps among Jewish or Arabic-speaking communities that had contact with European trading networks. Others have looked even further afield to Central Asia, to the Caucasus, or to other regions where unknown scripts and minority languages might have been in use. The truth is that we do not know where the manuscript was made. We can narrow it down to Central Europe with reasonable confidence, but we cannot identify a specific city or workshop. And without knowing where it was made, we cannot fully understand the cultural and intellectual context in which it was created, which in turn makes it harder to figure out what it means. And this is the fundamental challenge of the Voynich Manuscript. Every piece of information we have is a fragment. Every clue leads to more questions. The manuscript is like a hall of mirrors, reflecting our own ideas and assumptions back at us while revealing nothing of itself. We project our own theories, our own biases, our own desires onto its blank, beautiful, infuriating pages. But the desire to understand, the drive to solve the puzzle, never fades. It burns in every person who sees the manuscript for the first time and feels the strange pull of its mystery. It burned in Berch in 17th century Prague. It burned in Voynich in early 20th century Rome. It burned in Friedman in mid-20th century offices filled with cigarette smoke and the hum of early computers. And it burns today in libraries and laboratories and living rooms around the world, wherever someone opens a high-resolution scan of the manuscript on their computer screen and thinks, maybe I can see something no one else has seen. If you have been with us from part 1, you already know that the Voynich manuscript is unlike anything else that has ever existed. You already know that it was created on calfskin vellum sometime between 1404 and 1438. You already know that its pages are filled with an unknown script, unidentifiable plants, mysterious astronomical diagrams, and dozens of naked women bathing in elaborate networks of tubes and pools. You already know that it has defeated codebreakers, linguists, historians, and computer scientists for over a century. You already know that some of the greatest minds in human history have tried to read this book and failed. But what you do not know yet is what has happened in the last few decades, because the story of the Voynich Manuscript did not end with William Friedman or John Tiltman or any of the other 20th century giants who wrestled with the mystery. The story has continued into our own era, an era of supercomputers, artificial intelligence, big data analysis, and global collaboration. The tools we now have at our disposal are unimaginably more powerful than anything available to previous generations of researchers, and these tools have been aimed squarely at the Voynich Manuscript, with results that are both fascinating and, in the end, deeply humbling. Let us begin with the computational approaches, because this is where the most significant recent work has been done. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 21st century, researchers began using computers to analyze the Voynich text in ways that would have been impossible by hand. The basic idea was simple. If the human brain could not crack the code, perhaps a machine could. Computers could process vast quantities of data, identify statistical patterns invisible to the human eye, and test millions of hypotheses in the time it would take a human to test one. The first step was to create a digital transcription of the Voynich text. This was not as straightforward as it might sound. Because the script is unknown, researchers had to develop systems for representing each character with a standard symbol that a computer could process. Several transcription alphabets have been developed over the years, the most widely used being the European Voynich alphabet, or EVA, created by René Zandbergen and Gabriel Landini in the late 1990s. EVA assigns a Roman letter or combination of letters to each Voynich character, allowing the text to be typed, searched, and analyzed using standard computer tools. But here is the problem with transcription. When you transcribe the Voynich text into EVA or any other system, you are making decisions about what counts as a single character, where one character ends and another begins, and whether certain marks are separate characters or variations of the same character. These decisions are subjective, and different researchers have made different choices. The result is that different transcriptions of the same manuscript page can differ from each other, sometimes in significant ways. This introduces uncertainty into every computational analysis because the results you get depend on the transcription you use. Despite these challenges, computational analysis has produced some genuinely important findings. One of the most significant early studies was conducted by Prescott Currier, a naval intelligence cryptanalyst who analyzed the manuscript in the 1970s. Currier discovered that the text could be divided into two distinct groups, which he labeled Language A and Language B. These two groups differ in their statistical properties, their word frequencies, and their character combinations. Language A tends to appear in the herbal section of the manuscript, while Language B tends to appear in the biological and pharmaceutical sections. Currier's finding was groundbreaking because it suggested that the manuscript was not a uniform text written in a single system. It appeared to involve at least two different systems or two different authors, each with their own statistical signature. This finding has been confirmed and refined by later researchers and remains one of the most robust observations about the Voynich text. What does the existence of two languages mean? There are several possibilities. It could mean that the manuscript was written by two different scribes, each using slightly different conventions or dialects. It could mean that the author deliberately used two different encoding methods for different sections, perhaps because the content of those sections required different approaches. Or it could mean something else entirely, something we have not thought of yet. Another major computational finding came from the work of Jorge Stolfi, a computer scientist at the University of Campinas in Brazil. Stolfi conducted extensive statistical analyses of the Voynich text in the late 1990s and early 2000s and discovered several remarkable properties. He found that the Voynich text has an unusually rigid word structure. Words in the Voynich text appear to be built from a small number of functional elements that combine according to strict rules. Certain elements always appear at the beginning of words, others always appear in the middle, others always appear at the end. This is somewhat similar to the way words are constructed in agglutinative languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Korean, where words are built by combining prefixes, roots, and suffixes according to grammatical rules. Stolfi proposed that the Voynich text might represent a language with a very regular, almost mechanical word-building system. This could explain both the language-like statistical properties of the text and its unusual regularity. A language with very strict rules for word construction would produce text that was more predictable and less random than most natural languages, which would account for the low entropy that researchers have observed. But Stolfi's analysis also revealed something troubling. The word structure of the Voynich text is so regular that it seems almost too perfect. In most natural languages, there are exceptions to the rules, irregular forms, borrowed words, slang, and other deviations from strict grammatical patterns. The Voynich text shows very few such deviations. Its regularity is machine-like, which could be evidence for the artificial language theory, the Hoax theory, or something else entirely. Let us now talk about one of the most ambitious and most publicized computational attacks on the Voynich Manuscript. In 2016 and 2017, researchers at the University of Alberta in Canada, led by computer scientist Greg Kondrak, used artificial intelligence and natural language processing techniques to analyze the Voynich text. Their approach involved training machine learning algorithms on hundreds of human languages, and then using those algorithms to try to identify the language underlying the Voynich text. Kondrak and his team announced their preliminary findings in 2018, and the results generated enormous media attention. The algorithms suggested that the most likely underlying language was Hebrew. The researchers then attempted to decode portions of the text using Hebrew as the base language and reported that they could extract what appeared to be meaningful Hebrew words and phrases. One widely reported result was that the first sentence of the manuscript, when decoded, appeared to read something like, "She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people." The media coverage was breathless. Headlines around the world proclaimed that the Voynich manuscript had been decoded. But the reaction from the scholarly community was much more cautious. Experts in Hebrew, medieval linguistics, and Voynich studies quickly pointed out serious problems with the methodology and the results. The machine learning algorithm had identified Hebrew as the most likely candidate, but only with a probability of about 80%, and the algorithm's training data and assumptions were questioned. The decoded sentences were fragmentary, inconsistent, and did not produce coherent, meaningful text when applied to larger portions of the manuscript. Several Hebrew scholars who examined the results said that the decoded words did not constitute genuine Hebrew text. The Kondrak study, like so many Voynich studies before it, turned out to be less than it initially appeared. It was a fascinating exercise in computational linguistics, and it advanced the state of the art in applying machine learning to unknown scripts, but it did not crack the Voynich code. The manuscript remained unread. This pattern of hope and disappointment has repeated itself with every major computational study. In 2013, a team of physicists and linguists, led by Marcelo Montemurro of the University of Manchester, published a study in the journal PLOS1 that analyzed the semantic content of the Voynich text using a technique called network analysis. They mapped the relationships between words in the text, looking at which words tended to appear near each other and how word usage varied across different sections of the manuscript. Their analysis revealed that the Voynich text had a complex hierarchical structure similar to that found in genuine natural languages. Words were organized into clusters that corresponded to the different sections of the manuscript, just as you would expect if the sections discussed different topics. Montemurro and his colleagues concluded that the Voynich text carried meaningful content and was not random gibberish or a hoax. Their study was widely cited as evidence against the hoax theory and in favor of the manuscript containing genuine linguistic content, but their analysis could not tell us what that content was. Proving that a text is meaningful is not the same as being able to read it. You can show that a locked box contains something, but that does not help you open the box. Meanwhile, other researchers were approaching the problem from entirely different angles. Instead of trying to crack the code computationally, some turned to the illustrations for clues. In 2014, a team of botanists led by Arthur Tucker of Delaware State University published a paper arguing that several of the plants in the Voynich manuscript could be identified as species native to Mexico and Central and South regions. Tucker and his colleague Rixford Talbert claimed to have identified plants such as a species of water lily, a type of morning glory, and a particular variety of pepper. They proposed that the manuscript was created in the New World, possibly by an Aztec or other indigenous author, and that the text was written in an indigenous language, perhaps Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. Tucker's theory was creative and provocative, but it faced serious objections. The carbon dating of the vellum places the manuscript's creation between 1404 and 1438, which is before the major European voyages of discovery. While Norse explorers had reached the North Atlantic long before this date, there is no evidence that they had contact with the cultures of Mesoamerica. Moreover, the physical properties of the vellum, ink, and pigments are consistent with European production, not New World production. Most scholars dismiss Tucker's identifications as seeing what you want to see in ambiguous illustrations, the same trap that has caught so many Voynich researchers before. Other botanical approaches have fared no better. In 2004, a researcher named Sergio Torsella, an expert on medieval herbals, examined the Voynich plants and concluded that many of them were fantasy plants, deliberately invented rather than observed from nature. Torsella noted that there was a medieval tradition of creating fictional herbals, books that imitated the style of genuine herbals but contained invented plants with made-up properties. These books were sometimes created as exercises in artistic imagination, sometimes as parodies, and sometimes as deliberate frauds designed to deceive buyers. Torsella suggested that the Voynich manuscript might belong to this tradition, but even Torsella's explanation raises more questions than it answers. If the plants are deliberately fictional, what is the text about? Is it fictional too? And if the entire manuscript is a fictional creation, what was its purpose? Medieval fictional herbals were typically short and obviously humorous or fantastical. The Voynich manuscript is long, serious in tone, and shows every sign of being a major intellectual undertaking. Creating a 240-page fictional manuscript with an invented script seems like an enormous amount of work for a joke or an exercise. Let us turn now to the question that haunts every Voynich researcher. Is the text meaningful or meaningless? This is the great dividing line in Voynich studies, the question that separates those who believe the manuscript contains genuine knowledge from those who believe it is an elaborate fraud. The case for meaningfulness rests on several pillars. First, the statistical properties of the text are consistent with natural language. Word frequency distributions follow Zipf's law. Character frequencies show the kind of distribution you would expect in a genuine writing system. Words cluster by topic across different sections. There are consistent patterns in how words begin and end. These features would be extremely difficult to fake, especially by hand, especially in the 15th century. Second, the text shows the kind of subtle, complex structure that is very hard to produce artificially. The word-building rules identified by Stolfi, the semantic networks identified by Montemurro, the sectional vocabulary differences identified by Courier, All of these suggest a genuine, functioning linguistic system at work. Random gibberish or mechanically generated text might mimic some of these features, but it is very hard to imagine a process that would mimic all of them simultaneously. Third, the manuscript as a whole has the characteristics of a genuine intellectual work. It is organized into sections. It has illustrations that relate to the text. It is carefully produced with high-quality materials. Whoever created it invested an enormous amount of time, money, and effort. This is not the behavior of someone creating meaningless nonsense. This is the behavior of someone who has something to say. The case against meaningfulness also has its pillars. First, every attempt to decode the text has failed. If the text were a simple cipher hiding a known language, modern cryptanalysis should have cracked it by now. The fact that it has not been cracked suggests either that the encoding is extraordinarily sophisticated, far beyond anything else known from the period, or that there is nothing to decode. Second, the card-and-grill method proposed by Gordon Rugg demonstrated that it is at least theoretically possible to generate text with some Voynich-like properties using a simple mechanical method. While Rugg's method does not reproduce all of the manuscript's statistical features, it shows that the existence of language-like patterns does not necessarily prove the existence of genuine language. Third, some features of the text are deeply suspicious. The very low entropy, the extreme regularity of word structure, the near absence of corrections and errors, these are not typical of natural handwritten text. They are more consistent with text generated by some kind of mechanical or rule-based process, which could be either a sophisticated encoding method or a gibberish-generating machine. The debate continues to this day, and it shows no signs of being resolved anytime soon. Both sides can point to evidence in their favor, and neither side can deliver the knockout blow that would settle the question once and for all. Let us step back now from the technical analysis and talk about something equally important, the cultural impact of the Voynich Manuscript. Because this book has escaped the world of academic research and become a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of mystery and the unknown that has penetrated deep into the popular imagination. The Voynich Manuscript has appeared in novels, short stories, films, television shows, video games, and works of art. It has inspired musicians, poets, and playwrights. It has become a shorthand for the idea of unbreakable secrets and unknowable knowledge. When people want to evoke the sense of a mystery that cannot be solved, they often reach for the Voynich Manuscript as their example. One of the earliest and most influential fictional treatments of the manuscript was in the work of the Italian novelist and semiotician Umberto Eco. Eco, who was also a serious scholar of medieval philosophy and semiotics, was fascinated by the Voynich Manuscript and referenced it in several of his works. His novel Foucault's Pendulum, published in 1988, is a complex, multi-layered story about conspiracy theories, secret societies, and the human tendency to find hidden meanings in random events. The Voynich Manuscript fits perfectly into the novel's themes, and while it is not the central focus, its spirit pervades the entire work. Other novels have taken the manuscript as their direct subject. The Book of God and Physics by Enrique Joven, The Rule of Four by Ian Caldwell and Dustin Thomason, and Codex by Lev Grossman all draw on the Voynich Manuscript for inspiration, using fictionalized versions of the manuscript and its history as the basis for mystery and adventure plots. The television series Alias featured the Voynich Manuscript as a major plot element, with the manuscript serving as a key to a larger conspiracy involving a fictional Renaissance genius named Milo Rambaldi. The manuscript has appeared in video games including Assassin's Creed and has been referenced in countless documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube videos. But the Voynich Manuscript's cultural impact goes beyond specific works of fiction. It has become a touchstone for a broader cultural fascination with the unknown. In an age when it seems like all the mysteries have been solved, all the blank spaces on the map have been filled in, and all the secrets have been revealed by science and technology, the Voynich Manuscript stands as a stubborn reminder that there are still things we do not understand. It is a monument to the limits of human knowledge, and in a strange way, that is comforting. It tells us that the world is still full of surprises, that there are still discoveries waiting to be made, that we have not figured everything out. The manuscript has also become a magnet for conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. There are people who believe the manuscript was written by aliens. There are people who believe it contains prophecies about the end of the world. There are people who believe it is a coded message from a secret society, perhaps the Knights Templar, perhaps the Illuminati, perhaps some other shadowy organization. There are people who believe it is a manual for a lost technology, perhaps a blueprint for a perpetual motion machine or a formula for turning lead into gold. There are people who believe it is a map to buried treasure. None of these theories have any credible evidence to support them. They are products of the same pattern-seeking instinct that leads more serious researchers astray, the tendency to project meaning onto the unknown, but they are a testament to the manuscript's power. No other book in history has generated such a wide and wild range of speculation. The Voynich Manuscript is a blank canvas onto which the human imagination has painted everything from science fiction to religious prophecy. Now let us talk about the modern community of Voynich researchers, because this community is one of the most interesting and unusual in all of scholarship. Voynich studies is not a recognized academic discipline. There are no departments of Voynich studies at any university. There are no tenured professors of Voynich studies. There is no journal of Voynich studies. And yet there is a thriving, active, global community of people who devote significant portions of their time and energy to studying the manuscript. This community is remarkably diverse. It includes professional academics, tenured professors of linguistics, computer science, medieval history, botany, and other fields, who study the manuscript as a sideline to their main research. It includes retired military cryptanalysts who bring decades of code-breaking experience to the problem. It includes amateur enthusiasts with no formal academic training but with deep passion and considerable self-taught expertise. It includes artists, novelists, conspiracy theorists, and internet trolls. It includes some genuinely brilliant people and some genuinely deluded people, and it is not always easy to tell which is which. The center of this community, to the extent that it has a center, is the internet. The Voynich Manuscript mailing list, established in the early days of the World Wide Web, was for many years the primary forum for discussion and debate. Today, discussion has spread across multiple platforms, including dedicated websites, forums, social media groups, and blogs. The most important online resource for Voynich research is probably the website maintained by René Zandbergen, a Dutch engineer who has spent decades studying the manuscript and who has compiled an extraordinary amount of information about its history, its physical properties, and the various theories that have been proposed to explain it. Zandbergen's website is a model of careful, thorough scholarship. It presents the evidence dispassionately, evaluates claims critically, and makes clear what is known, what is suspected, and what is pure speculation. It is an invaluable resource for anyone who wants to study the manuscript seriously, and it serves as a counterweight to the wilder theories and unfounded claims that circulate on the internet. But the Voynich community is not always a harmonious one. There are fierce debates, bitter feuds, and heated arguments that have raged for years. Some of these debates are about substantive issues, such as whether the text is meaningful or meaningless, or whether a particular claimed decipherment is valid. Others are about more personal matters, involving accusations of plagiarism, incompetence, or bad faith. The intensity of these conflicts reflects the depth of passion that the manuscript inspires. People who study the Voynich manuscript tend to feel very strongly about their work, and they do not take kindly to criticism. One of the most persistent sources of conflict is the phenomenon of claimed decipherments. As we discussed in Part 1, people have been claiming to have decoded the Voynich manuscript for over a century, and these claims are almost always wrong, but they keep coming at an accelerating rate thanks to the internet's ability to amplify any voice, no matter how ill-informed. Every few months, a new article appears somewhere, sometimes in a reputable newspaper, sometimes in a dubious blog, announcing that someone has finally cracked the Voynich code. The claims are always exciting, always detailed, and always wrong. The community's response to these claims follows a predictable pattern. First, there's a brief period of excitement as people rush to evaluate the new claim. Then the experts get to work, applying their knowledge and analytical skills to the proposed solution. Invariably, they find fatal flaws. The proposed solution does not work consistently across the manuscript. It produces gibberish when applied to sections other than the cherry-picked examples used in the announcement. It relies on assumptions that are historically or linguistically untenable. Within days or weeks, the new claim is debunked, and the community settles back into its usual routine of careful, incremental analysis. This cycle of hope and disappointment has been going on for so long that many experienced Voynich researchers have become deeply skeptical of all claimed decipherments. Some have adopted a policy of ignoring new claims entirely unless they come from researchers with established credibility in relevant fields. Others engage with each new claim politely but critically, applying the same rigorous standards they would apply to any scholarly claim. A few have given up on the idea of decipherment altogether and focus instead on understanding the manuscript's physical properties, provenance, and historical context, questions that can be answered with existing methods. Let us now delve into some of the more intriguing specific theories that have emerged in recent years, theories that go beyond simple claimed decipherments and attempt to understand the manuscript in a broader context. One of the most thought-provoking recent theories was proposed by Stephen Bax, a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Bedfordshire in England. Bax, who tragically died in 2017, approached the Voynich Manuscript not as a code to be broken, but as an unknown script to be deciphered. He argued that the text was written in a natural language using a script that had been invented for that purpose, similar to the way that many scripts throughout history have been invented to write languages that previously had no writing system. Bax's method was to start with the illustrations. He looked at the botanical drawings and tried to identify specific plants. For each plant he believed he could identify, he looked at the accompanying text for words that might be the name of that plant. By comparing these words with the names of the identified plants in various languages, he hoped to match Voynich characters to specific sounds. Using this method, Bax claimed to have identified a handful of Voynich words and characters. He believed he had identified the word for Taurus in the zodiac section, the word for juniper in the herbal section, and several other terms. He published his findings and invited other researchers to test and extend his work. Bax's approach was methodologically sound in principle. This is essentially the same technique that was used to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. Champollion started with proper names, the names of pharaohs that were known from Greek sources, and used those names to identify the sound values of individual hieroglyphic characters. If Bax could reliably identify even a few Voynich words through their illustrations, the same bootstrapping process might eventually lead to a full decipherment. But in practice, Bax's identifications were tentative and contested. His plant identifications were not universally accepted, and the chain of reasoning from illustration to plant name to Voynich character was long and fragile. A mistake at any point in the chain could invalidate the entire analysis. After his death, some researchers continued to develop his ideas, but progress has been slow and the results remain uncertain. Another interesting approach has been taken by researchers who focus not on the text itself, but on the manuscript's relationship to other medieval documents. If the Voynich manuscript could be linked to a specific intellectual tradition, a specific school of medicine, a specific alchemical practice, a specific astronomical tradition, then the context provided by that tradition might help decode the text. One such effort has focused on the astronomical diagrams. Researchers have tried to match the Voynich zodiac illustrations and star charts to specific astronomical traditions, hoping to find parallels that would reveal the author's cultural and geographic background. Some have pointed to similarities with Islamic astronomical manuscripts, which were widely available in translation in 15th century Europe. Others have noted parallels with Jewish astrological traditions. Still others have compared the Voynich diagrams to Central European astronomical manuscripts of the period. So far, no definitive match has been found. The Voynich astronomical diagrams share some general features with medieval astronomical manuscripts, such as the use of zodiac symbols and concentric circular diagrams, but the specific details do not align closely with any known tradition. As always with the Voynich manuscript, things look familiar at a distance but become strange and unfamiliar upon closer inspection. A particularly fascinating line of inquiry has explored the possibility that the Voynich manuscript might be related to the medieval practice of medicine, specifically to the tradition of Galenic medicine that dominated European medical practice throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Galenic medicine was based on the theories of Galen, a Greek physician who lived in the 2nd century and whose ideas dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen taught that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these humors in balance, and disease resulted from an imbalance. Treatment involved restoring the balance through various means, including herbal medicines, dietary changes, bloodletting, and therapeutic bathing. The Voynich manuscript's combination of herbal illustrations, pharmaceutical preparations, astronomical diagrams, and bathing scenes fits remarkably well with the Galenic medical tradition. In Galenic medicine, the properties of plants and the effectiveness of treatments were believed to be influenced by celestial events. Certain plants were best harvested at certain times. Certain treatments were best administered when particular stars or planets were in particular positions. Therapeutic bathing was a widely used treatment for various conditions, and the design of bathing facilities sometimes reflected cosmological ideas about the flow of celestial influences through the natural world. If the Voynich manuscript is a medical text in the Galenic tradition, then its organization makes sense. The herbal section would describe the plants used in treatment. The astronomical section would describe the celestial conditions that govern the effectiveness of treatments. The balneological section would describe therapeutic bathing procedures. The pharmaceutical section would describe how to prepare medicines. And the text-heavy final section might contain general medical advice, recipes, or theoretical discussions. This interpretation is attractive, but it does not help us read the text. Knowing the general subject matter of a document is useful, but it is not the same as being able to translate it, and the fundamental problem remains. The text is in an unknown script and an unknown language, and without a key, it cannot be read. Let us now consider one of the most important questions about the Voynich manuscript, a question that is often overlooked amid the excitement of decipherment attempts and conspiracy theories. Why does this manuscript matter? Why should anyone care about a strange old book that might not even say anything meaningful? The answer is that the Voynich manuscript matters because of what it tells us about the nature of knowledge, the limits of understanding, and the human relationship with the unknown. We live in an age of information. We have more knowledge at our fingertips than any previous generation in human history. We can access the collected wisdom of centuries with a few taps on a screen. We have mapped the human genome, we have sent robots to other planets, we have peered back in time to the first moments after the birth of the universe. It is easy to believe that there is nothing left to discover, no mystery that cannot be solved, no code that cannot be cracked. The Voynich manuscript is a corrective to that hubris. It is a reminder that there are limits to what we can know. It is a small, old book that has defeated the greatest minds and the most powerful technologies we have been able to bring to bear on it. It sits in its vault at Yale, quiet and patient, and it waits. It has been waiting for 600 years. It can wait 600 more, and there is something profound about that patience. The Voynich Manuscript does not care whether we understand it. It does not need our understanding. It simply exists, a record of someone's thought and effort and creativity, preserved across centuries of war, plague, revolution, and change. Whoever created it poured hours, weeks, perhaps months or years of their life into its pages. They had something they wanted to say, or something they wanted to hide, or something they wanted to create, and they succeeded. Their creation has survived when countless other manuscripts have been lost to fire, water, neglect, and decay. It has outlived empires and outlasted civilizations, and it has, in its stubborn illegibility, achieved a kind of immortality that no ordinary book could ever match, because think about it. If the Voynich Manuscript could be read, if someone cracked the code tomorrow and published a full translation, what would happen? There would be a brief period of intense excitement. Scholars would rush to study the translation. The media would run stories about the great mystery finally being solved. And then people would read the translation and probably be disappointed, because the content, whatever it is almost certainly less interesting than the mystery. If it is a medical text, it would be a medical text full of outdated, pre-scientific ideas about humors and astrology. If it is an alchemical text, it would be full of wrong ideas about chemistry. If it is a herbal, the plant identifications would be of historical interest but no practical use. The mystery of the Voynich Manuscript is, in a very real sense, more valuable than its solution. This is not to say that we should not try to solve it. Of course we should try. The drive to understand is one of the noblest impulses of the human mind, and giving up on a puzzle simply because the solution might be disappointing would be a betrayal of everything that makes us human. But we should also appreciate the mystery for what it is. We should appreciate the sense of wonder and humility that the Voynich Manuscript inspires. We should appreciate the fact that in a world where answers are just a search engine query away, there are still questions that resist all our efforts, still secrets that keep their counsel, still locked rooms that no key can open. Now let us talk about something that has become increasingly important in Voynich studies in recent years, the role of multidisciplinary collaboration. For most of its history, the Voynich Manuscript has been studied by individuals or small groups working in isolation. A cryptanalyst would analyze the text using the tools of cryptanalysis. A linguist would analyze the text using the tools of linguistics. A historian would study the provenance using the tools of historical research. A botanist would study the plants using the tools of botany. But these efforts were largely separate, with limited communication between different disciplines. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition that the Voynich Manuscript requires a truly multidisciplinary approach. The manuscript sits at the intersection of so many fields: linguistics, cryptography, history, art history, botany, astronomy, chemistry, computer science, information theory, that no single discipline has the tools to tackle it alone. What is needed is a collaborative effort that brings together experts from all these fields and allows them to share insights, challenge each other's assumptions, and build on each other's work. Some efforts in this direction have already been made. The carbon dating study, for example, brought together physicists, chemists, and historians. The computational studies have brought together computer scientists and linguists. The material analysis of the ink and pigments has brought together chemists and art historians, but these collaborations have been ad hoc and limited. What is needed is a more systematic, sustained, and coordinated effort. Some researchers have proposed the creation of a formal research center or institute devoted to the study of the Voynich Manuscript, a place where experts from multiple disciplines could work together full-time, with access to the original manuscript, to high-resolution digital scans, and to the latest analytical tools. Such an institute might not solve the mystery, but it would at least ensure that the best available expertise was being brought to bear in a coordinated and efficient way. Whether such an institute will ever be created remains to be seen. The Voynich Manuscript, for all its fame, is not a high priority for the institutions and funding agencies that support academic research. There are bigger problems in the world, more urgent mysteries to solve, more pressing challenges to address. The Voynich Manuscript is, in the grand scheme of things, a curiosity. An extraordinary curiosity, to be sure, but a curiosity nonetheless. And yet the history of science is full of cases where the study of apparent curiosities led to profound discoveries. The study of fossils, once considered mere curiosities of nature, led to the theory of evolution. The study of strange patterns in the inheritance of pea plants led to the science of genetics. The study of an unusual form of mold growing on a petri dish led to the discovery of penicillin. You never know where a curiosity will lead you, and the Voynich Manuscript, with its rich complexity and its stubborn resistance to understanding, might yet lead somewhere unexpected. Let us return now to the question of the manuscript's origins and consider some of the most recent thinking about who might have created it and why. One of the most interesting recent hypotheses involves the possibility that the manuscript was created by a community rather than an individual. This theory is based on the observation, discussed earlier, that the text appears to have been written by at least two different scribes. If the manuscript was a community project, then the community must have shared knowledge of the encoding system or language used in the text. This argues against theories involving personal idiosyncrasy or individual madness and in favor of some kind of shared intellectual tradition. What kind of community might have created such a manuscript? Several possibilities have been proposed. One is a religious community, perhaps a monastery or convent, where the members had developed a private script for recording their observations and ideas. Monastic communities in medieval Europe were centers of learning and literacy, and some monasteries developed their own distinctive styles of writing and illustration. It is not inconceivable that a particularly secretive or intellectually adventurous community might have developed its own script or cipher. Another possibility is a guild of physicians or apothecaries. Medieval medical practice was often organized around guilds, and these guilds sometimes guarded their knowledge jealously. A guild might have developed a private writing system to record proprietary medical knowledge, ensuring that their recipes and techniques could not be stolen by competitors. The medical content of the Voynich Manuscript, if that is indeed what it is, would fit well with this hypothesis. A third possibility is a community of Jewish scholars in Central Europe. Jewish communities in medieval Europe were often multilingual, using Hebrew for religious purposes, the local vernacular for daily life, and sometimes Arabic or other languages for scientific and philosophical writing. Some Jewish communities developed their own scripts and codes, partly for practical reasons and partly for mystical purposes. The Kabbalistic tradition, which was influential in Jewish intellectual life during this period, placed great emphasis on the hidden meanings of letters and numbers and might have inspired the creation of an encrypted text. This Jewish hypothesis has been explored by several researchers. The Kondrak study we discussed earlier identified Hebrew as the most likely underlying language. Other researchers have pointed to similarities between some Voynich characters and Hebrew or Aramaic letter forms. The theory that the manuscript was created by a Jewish community in Central Europe is compatible with the carbon-dated range, the physical properties of the manuscript, and the medical and astrological content. But it has not been proven, and the claimed connections between Voynich characters and Hebrew are tenuous at best. Recently, a theory involving the Cathars, a medieval Christian sect considered heretical by the Catholic Church, gained some attention. The Cathars were ruthlessly persecuted and eventually exterminated by the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, but some researchers have speculated that Cathar ideas and texts might have survived in hidden form. Under this theory, the Voynich manuscript might be a Cathar text, encoded to protect it from the Inquisition, but this theory has little evidence to support it. The Cathars were largely destroyed by the early 14th century, 100 years before the manuscript was created. And the content of the manuscript, as far as we can judge from the illustrations, does not seem to relate to Cathar theology, which was focused on spiritual purity and the rejection of the material world, not on plants, stars, and bathing women. Let us consider yet another angle. What if the Voynich manuscript is not trying to hide its meaning at all? What if it is written in a language that was perfectly readable to its intended audience, but that has simply been lost to history? Throughout history, countless languages have been born, flourished, and died without leaving any written record. Some linguists estimate that tens of thousands of languages have existed over the course of human history, and only a tiny fraction of them have been documented. In 15th century Europe, there were many minority languages and dialects spoken by small communities in remote areas. Some of these languages left no written records at all. Others left only a few fragmentary inscriptions or glosses. If the Voynich manuscript was written in one of these now lost languages, using a script invented for the purpose, then its illegibility to modern researchers would be easily explained. It is not a code, it is not a cipher, it is simply a language that no one speaks anymore. This theory is appealing in its simplicity, but it is very difficult to test. If the language is truly lost, with no surviving speakers and no other written records, then there is nothing to compare the Voynich text to. There is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription, no way to bootstrap a translation. The text would remain permanently unreadable, a voice speaking into a void where no one can hear it, and this brings us to the most melancholy possibility of all. It is possible, perhaps even probable, that the Voynich manuscript will never be deciphered. Not because the answer is too complex, but because the information needed to decode it simply no longer exists. The key, whatever it was, has been lost. The language, whatever it was, has died. The context, whatever it was, has been forgotten. We are left with the husk of a communication, beautiful and intricate and utterly hollow, like a shell on a beach that still echoes with the sound of a vanished ocean. But even this possibility, this most pessimistic of outcomes, does not diminish the manuscript's significance. If anything, it enhances it, because the Voynich manuscript in its magnificent silence teaches us something that no readable book could teach. It teaches us humility. It teaches us that the past is not fully recoverable, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that the river of human understanding does not flow in only one direction. It reminds us that for all our technological power and intellectual sophistication, we are not masters of the universe. We are creatures groping in the dark, lighting candles against the vastness of what we do not know. Now let us bring the story up to the present day, to the very latest developments in Voynich research. In 2020, Yale University made high-resolution digital scans of the entire Voynich manuscript available online for free. This was a watershed moment in Voynich studies because it meant that anyone in the world with an internet connection could examine the manuscript in extraordinary detail. Every page, every illustration, every character could be zoomed in on and studied at leisure. Previously, access to the manuscript had been limited to those who could visit Yale in person or obtain expensive facsimile editions. Now, a teenager in Tokyo or a retired teacher in Lagos could study the manuscript with the same level of detail as a professor at Yale. The democratization of access has led to an explosion of interest in the manuscript. Thousands of people who had never heard of the Voynich manuscript have discovered it through the online scans and have begun their own investigations. Social media groups dedicated to Voynich research have sprung up on every major platform. YouTube channels devoted entirely to the manuscript attract thousands of viewers. The Voynich manuscript has become, in a very real sense, a global crowdsourced research project. Whether this democratization will lead to a breakthrough remains to be seen. On one hand, the more people who study the manuscript, the greater the chance that someone will notice something that everyone else has missed. Great discoveries have sometimes been made by outsiders, by people who approach a problem from an unexpected angle because they are not constrained by the assumptions and conventions of established experts. On the other hand, the flood of amateur analysis has also produced a flood of bad theories, unfounded claims, and wishful thinking. Separating the signal from the noise has become harder than ever. In 2021, a researcher named Gerard Cheshire, the same one whose proto-romance theory we discussed in Part 1, published another paper claiming further progress on the manuscript. Once again, the paper received significant media attention. Once again, it was swiftly criticized and largely dismissed by experts. The cycle continues. Also, in recent years, researchers have begun applying the latest advances in artificial intelligence to the manuscript. Deep learning algorithms, which have achieved remarkable results in natural language processing, image recognition, and other fields, have been trained on the Voynich text. Neural networks have been used to analyze the statistical properties of the text, to search for hidden patterns, and to compare the Voynich script with hundreds of other writing systems. So far, these AI-based approaches have produced interesting observations, but no breakthroughs. The neural networks have confirmed many of the statistical findings of earlier researchers, such as the existence of two distinct language types, the topic-based clustering of vocabulary, and the unusually regular word structure. But they have not been able to identify the underlying language or produce a translation. One promising line of AI research involves using generative models to test the hoax hypothesis. Researchers have trained AI models to generate text using various methods, including random generation, Carden-Grill simulation, and Markov chain processes, and then compared the statistical properties of the generated text with those of the real Voynich text. The goal is to determine whether any known text generation method can produce text that matches all of the Voynich text's statistical features. If such a method can be found, it would strengthen the hoax hypothesis. If no such method can match the Voynich text's properties, it would strengthen the case for genuine linguistic content. Results so far have been mixed. Some generation methods can match some of the Voynich text's properties, but not others. No method has yet been found that matches all of them simultaneously. This is tentative evidence against the hoax hypothesis, but it is not conclusive. The space of possible text generation methods is vast, and it is always possible that a method has simply not been tried yet. Let us now consider the deepest, most philosophical questions raised by the Voynich manuscript. These are questions that go beyond the specifics of the manuscript itself and touch on fundamental issues about language, meaning, and the nature of communication. What does it mean for a text to be meaningful? This seems like a simple question, but the Voynich manuscript shows that it is anything but. We normally assume that a text is meaningful if it was written with the intention of communicating something, and meaningless if it was not. But how do we determine intention for a text whose author is unknown and whose content we cannot read? We are reduced to indirect evidence, statistical properties, structural patterns, physical characteristics, and the nature of the illustrations. But none of this evidence is conclusive. We can show that the text has properties consistent with meaningful communication, but we cannot prove that it is meaningful. And we can show that the text has properties that are unusual for natural language, but we cannot prove that it is meaningless. This situation highlights a deep truth about the nature of meaning itself. Meaning is not an intrinsic property of a text. It is a relationship between a text and a reader. A text is meaningful if there is someone who can understand it, and meaningless if there is not. The Voynich manuscript may have been perfectly meaningful to its original author and intended readers, but if those readers are gone and the key to understanding the text is lost, then the text has become meaningless in practice, even if it was meaningful in principle. It is like a telephone ringing in an empty room. The call is real, but there is no one to answer it. This raises an uncomfortable question about all of human knowledge. How much of what we know today will be incomprehensible to future generations? How much of our science, our art, our literature, our culture will survive the passage of time? We assume that our knowledge is permanent, recorded in books and databases and digital archives that will last forever. But the Voynich manuscript is a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Languages die, cultures vanish, empires crumble. And the knowledge they carried with them can be lost as completely and as irrevocably as a dream upon waking. The Voynich manuscript is also a meditation on the nature of secrets. We live in an age that distrusts secrets. We believe that information should be free, that transparency is a virtue, that every secret is a potential injustice waiting to be exposed. The Voynich Manuscript challenges this assumption. It is a secret that has kept itself for 600 years, and it has done so not through the power of any institution or the will of any authority, but simply through the ingenuity of its design. Whoever encoded this manuscript did so in a way that has resisted every attempt at breaking for over 6 centuries. This is an extraordinary achievement, regardless of whether the content is profound or trivial. It is proof that a secret, once properly made, can be permanent. And yet the Voynich Manuscript is also proof that secrets have a cost. Whatever knowledge the manuscript contains has been locked away from the world for 600 years. If it contains genuine medical knowledge, that knowledge could not help anyone. If it contains genuine astronomical observations, those observations could not advance science. If it contains genuine philosophical insights, those insights could not enrich human understanding. The secrecy that protected the knowledge also killed it, entombing it more effectively than any vault or any grave. There is a lesson here, a lesson about the trade-off between secrecy and sharing, between protection and accessibility. Knowledge that is shared is knowledge that lives. Knowledge that is hidden is knowledge that dies. The Voynich Manuscript's author chose secrecy, for whatever reason, and the result is that their life's work, their great effort, their painstaking creation, has become an object of curiosity rather than a source of wisdom. The manuscript is famous precisely because it cannot be read. If it could be read, it would probably be forgotten, just another medieval text gathering dust on a library shelf. There is an irony here that the manuscript's author could never have anticipated. By making their work unreadable, they ensured that it would be the most studied, most examined, most obsessed over manuscript in history. They achieved a kind of fame, but it is the fame of mystery, not the fame of understanding. Their book is known not for what it says, but for what it refuses to say. It is the most famous unread book in the world. Let us conclude with some thoughts about the future. What happens next in the story of the Voynich Manuscript? The honest answer is that no one knows. The manuscript has been studied for over a century, and we are not significantly closer to reading it than we were when Voynich first purchased it in 1912. This does not mean that progress has not been made. We know far more about the manuscript's physical properties, its provenance, and its statistical characteristics than we did a century ago. We have eliminated many theories and refined our understanding of the problem. But the fundamental challenge, reading the text, remains unsolved. There are grounds for cautious optimism. The continuing advancement of artificial intelligence and machine learning offers new tools that previous generations of researchers did not have. The democratization of access to the manuscript through online scans has expanded the pool of people working on the problem. New analytical techniques such as multispectral imaging, which can reveal text or marks that are invisible to the naked eye, might uncover hidden clues in the manuscript itself. And there is always the possibility of a chance discovery, a forgotten letter in an archive, a related manuscript in a private collection, a Rosetta Stone that provides the key. But there are also grounds for pessimism. Every new tool that has been applied to the manuscript has failed to crack the code. Every new theory has been debunked or found wanting. The manuscript has a remarkable ability to resist understanding, and there is no guarantee that future tools and theories will fare any better than past ones. Perhaps the most realistic assessment is that the Voynich Manuscript will remain a mystery for a very long time, possibly forever, and perhaps that is acceptable. Perhaps the mystery is the point. Perhaps the Voynich Manuscript's greatest contribution to human culture is not any knowledge it might contain, but the reminder it provides that the universe is vast and strange and full of things we do not understand. In a world that prizes certainty and control, the Voynich Manuscript is a hymn to uncertainty and wonder. Imagine, one final time, the person who created this manuscript. Imagine them sitting at a desk in a workshop somewhere in Central Europe 600 years ago. The room is lit by candles or perhaps by the light from a narrow window. The desk is cluttered with jars of ink, piles of prepared vellum, reference materials, perhaps real plants or astronomical instruments. The person picks up a quill, dips it in iron gall ink, and begins to write. The characters flow from their pen in a steady, practiced hand. They know what they are writing. They know what the words mean. The script is as natural to them as breathing. They write page after page, filling the vellum with their knowledge, their observations, their thoughts. They paint the illustrations with care, choosing their pigments and applying them with the skill of someone who has done this many times before. They are creating something they believe is important, something they want to preserve, something they want to protect, and they succeed in a way they could never have imagined. Their manuscript survives. It passes from hand to hand, from century to century, from one end of Europe to the other. It outlives the Great Plague. It outlives the religious wars. It outlives the rise and fall of dynasties. It crosses oceans. It enters the digital age. It is scanned and uploaded and viewed by millions. 600 years after its creation, it is the most famous mystery in the world, but the person who created it is gone. Their name is forgotten. Their language is lost. Their world has vanished so completely that we cannot even identify the plants they drew. They are as unknowable to us as we would be to them. And the bridge they built between their mind and ours, the manuscript, the record, the book, stands broken in the middle, reaching out from both sides but connecting nothing. Or maybe it does connect something. Maybe the Voynich Manuscript connects us not through understanding but through wonder. Maybe the fact that we cannot read it is what makes it so powerful. Because it forces us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. It forces us to sit with not knowing, to accept uncertainty, to face the vast darkness of the past without flinching. And in that confrontation, in that acceptance of mystery, there is something deeply, profoundly human. We are the species that asks questions we cannot answer. We are the species that reaches for stars we cannot touch. We are the species that writes books no one can read. And we are the species that 600 years later refuses to stop trying. The Voynich Manuscript is not just a book, it is a mirror. It reflects back our deepest hopes, our greatest fears, and our most fundamental nature. It shows us who we are, curious, persistent, brilliant, fallible, and forever reaching for something just beyond our grasp. The mystery endures. The search continues. And somewhere in the silence of the Beinecke Library, the Voynich Manuscript waits, patient and inscrutable, for someone who may never come, or who might be watching right now. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the greatest mysteries in all of human history. If you have made it this far, you are now one of the most informed people in the world on the subject of the Voynich Manuscript. You know its history, you know its properties, you know the theories, you know the failures. And you know the questions that remain unanswered. Perhaps you will be the one to answer them. Remember to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Leave us a comment telling us what you think the Voynich Manuscript really is. Is it a medical text, an alchemical treatise, an artificial language, a brilliant hoax, something we have not thought of yet? We want to hear your theories. We want to hear your ideas, because the story of the Voynich Manuscript is not over. It is being written right now by everyone who looks at those strange, beautiful pages and refuses to look away. Until next time.